everyone to our webinar entitled Conflict, the Joys and Challenges. I'm your host, Lorraine Stutzman-Amstutz. I'm the denominational minister for peace and justice for Mennonite Church USA. And today I am happy to be joined by three esteemed guests. Michelle Armster, who is the executive director of Mennonite Central Committee, Central States. Reverend Dr. Jacob Allen Cook, who teaches Christian ethics and peace theology and co-directs the Shalom Collaboratory at Eastern Mennonite Seminary, and Hyacinth Stevens, who is the executive director of Mennonite Central Committee East Coast. Today's gathering depends on where you're located, I guess, but this afternoon for me, gathering is in webinar format. So all attendees are muted and the chat is disabled. We will, however, be posting some links in the chat so you can see those. Just to also let you know that Spanish translation is available and you can use the globe button at the bottom of your screen. For some of us, it's at the bottom of the screen. For some of us, it's under More button. We welcome your questions and we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature that's also at the bottom of the screen. And as panelists, we can see your questions. We also hope to be answering some of the pre-submitted questions. So thank you to those participants who were able to do that. So as time allows, we'll also try to get to some of them. So before we get started, let's pause for a moment of prayer. Loving and merciful God, we come before you, aware of the conflict and harm that often separates us from one another. We ask that you help us learn to listen with open hearts and speak in a way that invites conversation even when we disagree. Teach us how to recognize the humanity in one another and seek understanding over winning. Bless us with wisdom to see new possibilities in the midst of disagreement with one another. We entrust to you our relationships and our communities. Work through us in spite of ourselves to be instruments of your peace, sowing seeds of transformation where possible. In your name we pray. Amen. So before we get started hearing from our panelists, I want to just give a bit of context for today's webinar. So as we were working on our strategic goals at Mennonite Church USA for this year, I heard a repeated call to talk about conflict transformation within our congregations, within our organizations, to equip people with essential skills for effectively managing and both conflict, difficult conversations, and harm, all of the things. And I know that there's already great work happening, and yet we know it's not finite. That work is endless and can be done in many different ways. I think we could all likely benefit from conflict transformation training on a regular basis. I think we should all have facilitated dialogues with one another when things are difficult to remind us of who we want to be. Short of that, we can offer training that helps us practice that and how we live that out with one another. So for me, the conversation started with my colleague, Michelle Armster, mostly because we worked together for decades at Mennonite Central Committee, specifically around conflict transformation and restorative justice. We then connected with Jake Cook, who agreed that this was a significant part of the work that he was doing at Eastern Mennonite Seminary through a Lilly grant that he can talk more about. And we agreed that we wanted to host an initial training with a group of very specific participants that we invited, who we knew came with interest or expertise in this area, and that these participants could provide us with feedback so we could develop it with other groups over the next year or two. So that first training was held September 26 to 28 at Mennonite Central Committee in Akron, Pennsylvania. And we're so grateful to the group who joined us and provided invaluable contributions to our time together while we were together in person and to the ongoing work that we're going to be doing. So while Michelle and I planned the agenda, we invited Jake to also participate in a couple of the modules, as well as Jim Amstutz, who provided some sessions on trauma-informed care. Hyacinth was a participant in the training, so we wanted to hear from her perspective why she sees this as critical for the church as well, and we'll give her time to do that. So maybe we could start by hearing from Michelle and then Jake talking about kind of the significance of being involved in this work, and then maybe a little bit from Hyacinth to get us started talking about your participation in the group. So Michelle, let's start with you.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation and welcome to everyone that is here. Why this work is significant, I think, especially in these days and times, the polarization of conversation of people, and just how can we learn to talk to each other without calling people names or resulting in violence. And so I think that's what is significant about this work. I also, why this was important for me is it's been a number of years since Lorraine and I were able to train together. And that I miss that. I miss that work. I miss being reminded. I miss being challenged because life happens. And when life happens, sometimes those skills don't come back as quickly as you'd hope. So so this was a wonderful experience to be reflective, as well as to realize how critical it is in this day and age, especially in the church, even within our church. I just I that the political conversations, the uh, 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 conversations around different people, and just even being able to pray together can need mediation at times. Or so anyway, that's why I felt like it was significant, not only to get my to work out the cobwebs, but to also to participate and practice. So thank you.
No, thank you for this fantastic introduction, friends. I really appreciate the way Lorraine and Michelle, you've set this up and described already sort of multiple everyday ways that we can imagine conflict transformation skills and the mindset framework of conflict transformation showing up in our lives. It's an everyday thing. So for me, this work at Eastern Mennonite Seminary began with a survey of alumni and friends of the school asking, what do you think we're doing all right at, and where do you think maybe we could do some growing? And from that, we learned that while there are a number of things I'm sure we were doing well, one place that we had the potential to grow was in our relationship with the Center for Justice and Peace Building at Eastern Mennonite University. And in particular, helping folks who are going to be leading in church spaces as pastors, but also as laypersons, helping them grow into a formative space for navigating conflict, for healing communities and maintaining their health, for leadership that is transformational. And so I come to this with a real interest in the truth, the manifest truth that conflict is an everyday reality for us. That's descriptively true. But I've also heard ethicists recently arguing that it's also normatively true. It's actually a good thing for us that we are aware that we're in conflict, and that conflicts arise because our faith is dynamic. And it's responding to a context that is changing and requires a kind of dynamism from us. So we should expect conflict. And if that's true, then who do we want to be when conflict does come to us? because it's coming. So for me, the hope in doing this work together is that we might become the kind of people who can navigate conflict with some skill, that we can maintain our presence as who we want to be in the midst of challenges, and that perhaps maybe we could even grow together, make some progress together on things that we care about. So that's where I'm entering this conversation, as someone who's really fixated on how do we do this everyday thing that is conflict better than we might tend to if we're trying to avoid it all the time, or if we think conflict is failure.
Again, as others have already said, I am so grateful to be invited, was grateful to be a participant on the participant side of the engagement. And I've often said in previous conversations with Michelle and Lorraine, particularly around the difference between prescribing and practice. And so oftentimes we are connected to organizational culture, church culture, academic, institutional culture that has spent much time in our head around theory, around naming what should work. However, oftentimes those of us who study most may not have had as much time or space to be at practice, to be in the place of discovery. What shows up in us when we are in something that brings conflict or tension, or the anxieties, the way our body and our mind respond and have trauma triggers, because we are in the center. We are in the eye of the storm. What does that look like for us? How do we draw upon our toolkit in those moments? And so we're not going to go necessarily to our closet or our folder and say, okay, what did I learn at that workshop? Probably in the middle of crisis, we can't find that manual, or it's pretty dusty, right? Or we're like, where is it? And then we're trying to read and discover, oh, what did the facilitator mean again by that? No, we want to allow ourselves to have time to live in engagement with the tools. And so I have been so grateful. I am still in a residual gratitude for having 2 days to sit in practice, to be with people, to hear topics that I can think about and then practice. And so the more we practice, the more it becomes with, a part of, and I would even say permission to, right? We need permission as part of the daily reminder that conflict is with us. It's a part of us. It's in our environment. It's in the society. In some ways, it's embedded into our structure. So we need to remind ourselves, I need to be with conflict. I don't want to be conflict avoidant. And I want to practice my way through engagement. So I'll stop there.
I love the enthusiasm for conflict that I hear. It's one of the things I always say is I love conflict, especially when it's someone else's. When it's mine, not so much. But when it's someone else's, let's jump in. It's going to be, it's an opportunity, right? And we think about, if we could think about conflict that way. I remember for a number of years I've taught a conflict mediation class at Messiah with my spouse, and I particularly remember one year when two students were talking about their responses to conflict, and one was like all in. The other one said, no, never, never, never. If I never have a conflict, my life would be happy. And the other student said, oh, then I don't know if we can be friends, because until I've had like conflict with you, I don't think that we're friends, because I got to know how we're going to be in conflict. Determines a lot for them. And I think what an important statement to make, that if we're friends, we're going to have a conflict. So I kind of love that. So yeah, I think that opportunity to practice it, to think about it, and like Hyacinth, like you said, to have that knowing that can I draw on the things that I learn and see conflict as something positive, and it's going to help us get to a different and hopefully deeper place with one another. But can we draw on the best of who we want to be in conflict? And that's always the question. And I think that's why I say we could practice this every day, and we probably should, because that's where we're going to learn who we're going to be and how we're going to respond. I think I'd be interested in hearing any of you, and again, I'm going to start with Michelle, to talk about some of the different areas that we covered in the training that were significant and how they were significant. So we talked about cultural competency. We talked about trauma-informed care. We talked about emotional intelligence. And we talked about that being, how do we do those things in kind of healthy conflict, transformation, and restorative justice? How do those things play into that? So Michelle, if you want to start, and then Hyson or Jake, you want to jump in, that'd be great.
Thank you. One of the things that I found most significant for me was the ACEs tool, because it kind of provides just an understanding of what's going to trigger, what's going to be your triggers, the possibility of your triggers. And I think cultural competency also provides you with information on how your cultural mindset, what your cultural mindset is. Emotional intelligence, again, what your ability to regulate or self-regulate or self-awareness. And I think as people, though, to know yourself is the most important thing. To know those things about yourself is the most important things, because that is going to kind of help you understand conflict, or when you are in conflict. I want to also kind of piggyback on what everyone has said. Conflict is inevitable. Conflict is how life is life. How we respond to and in conflict is what we may have control over, but that requires us to be aware, either as a participant in a conflict, or in a participant in a harm, or as someone who's facilitating those types of processes. Because even as a facilitators, you can be triggered by what is going on with somebody or a group. You can be triggered by you're called in to do a church conflict, and you can be triggered by some of the statements or comments or even the issue itself. So it's important for one to know themselves in terms of their cultural competency, whether they can, and the level that they can engage difference, as well as knowing what the triggers may be from growing up, or trauma that has impacted your life, and then having a sense of your emotional intelligence, how you self-regulate, how you understand who you are and where you are, and be able to adapt or adjust if necessary. So it's all of that, and then some more. That's what I would say.
I just wanted to jump in to make a comment about ACEs, that it's the Adverse Childhood Experiences tool that people can take. So just to say what that is.
Mhm, mhm.
I would affirm wholeheartedly what Michelle has been saying as the starting point for all of this work. I think actually when I talk with folks in churches, the thing that is most relieving and simultaneously most frustrating is just how much of the work I give back to the individuals who show up to receive training. The kind of self-knowledge and then the practice of self-management in the midst of conflict is where something like 90% of what's going on in the room. That's where we have control, as Michelle said. And so it's critical to start there with as many tools as we have access to understand not only where are we coming from, and what's affecting us, what we're possibly carrying into the room, what could get tapped, but also then to ask, what are the best strategies that I can be carrying in my pocket for managing those aspects of myself that are there, and may well be justified and may well be positive in many contexts, right? How those mechanisms of response, how do I manage those? How do I manage those when I'm intervening in a situation that's not really mine, where I'm the professional who's called in to help? How do I do that at the family dinner table when we come together at the holidays? Can I do that? Am I the right person to do that? Those are all really, really important questions to ask. But to have access to tools then that help us manage that inner life is critical. That makes me think of a model that I've seen for how we live out peace and nonviolence in our lives, in a book by Chris Moore Bachman called The Gandhian Iceberg. And as we've heard, right, iceberg is a metaphor sometimes for how little we see above the surface and how much of the critical mass is really below the water. And in this model, understanding Gandhi's platform for nonviolence, Bachman is saying that what's going on underneath the iceberg, the biggest part of nonviolence, is what we practice with ourselves. It's self-transformation. And then the majority of what we see above the surface is that which we practice with our community that helps us become better practitioners of nonviolence, better at dealing honestly with conflict and working our way through it instead of avoiding it. And then, right, there is the tip of the iceberg, or those little points that stick out that are maybe a bit sharper. They're not that many, right? They're few, but they can make a big difference. And those are those episodes of really acute conflict, right? And the hope is that by way of all of this practice and the critical mass of the iceberg, we become the kind of people and the kind of communities that can respond to those moments consistently with who we want to be, with who we're training to be, with the whole of our lives.
Yeah, wow. I really appreciate here. I want to be taking some notes here as I'm even in this space with colleagues. I would say so I would say amen, if I can use that term here, for for what has already been said. Yes, and agree. One of the other moments that stand out to me, and even in this space here in the webinar and attending the workshop days, is the community part. And Michelle and Lorraine just referenced decades of working together. And I would say that is crucial. Part of the opportunity to get together with a group of about 20 people was that we were developing community around learning and engagement and resourcing each other. And so as we worked through even using almost like a circle process model for our starting point, every moment was a practice tool. So everything we did over the 2 days was a teaching, it was a resource, but it was also engagement and it was community. And they were not disconnected from each other. And as we work at conflict, I appreciated, Jacob, when you mentioned the Gandhian iceberg, if I'm getting that right, which also brings us back for some of us to the cultural iceberg when we work at intercultural competency and developing in that iceberg. It's underneath is the subjective culture. It's the roles, it's the behaviors, it's the beliefs, it's the norms. And I see this beautiful parallel about who we are in our own identity and our own journey of transformational engagement that parallels kind of side by side with that cultural iceberg, because who we are internally, our values, our beliefs and roles, it shapes how we then bump into what we want to say, here's our conflict. So these two icebergs are underneath colliding at different times, right? And so then what becomes the work underneath that surface to say, here is the work to not collide or just have like this explosion, but more of this discovery. What's underneath there? And how do we work at what's underneath in community? There is a part that is solitude, contemplative reflection, but there's also the part that is within community. And I would say like the workshop and some of these other training tools and opportunities allows us to go into these lab or think tank moments for us to do this in community. Because often when we are committed to engaging in transformative practice, restorative practice, that cannot happen only in a silo. It needs to happen in community. So I'll stop there.
I feel like all of these are like mini sermons. Like, I love that. Like, Hyson, you don't need permission to say amen. I think one of the things to keep in mind through all of this is our reason for wanting to be engaged in this work is because believing that this is what God calls us to be in healthy community with one another. And in order to do that, we have to acknowledge that there's conflict. We have to acknowledge that for our communities to be healthier, our congregations, our organizations, then we have to be willing to engage in it. So these skills are even more critical and important if that's what we believe we are being called to do. So for me, that's such an integral part of the work. And I think that as we're having these conversations about what we knowing ourselves, I feel like that's such a difference over the last 3 decades of work. I think before we were so much more focused on skill building. We just need to teach people skills. If they would just listen to one another, if they would just do this or that. And without really saying, as we talked about earlier, I think each of you have mentioned, who am I in this? What do I bring to it? I can't separate I as a white woman going into, depending on the context, that doesn't mean something. Like we think that doesn't matter because it absolutely does. So I think the more we learn about ourselves, and I feel like that's what we've spent more time doing as we think about a training, is we're equipping people to also know themselves and what they bring, because I think when we engage as facilitators, we shouldn't be doing more harm. And so we have to know ourselves. We have to know. One of the things I've thought about over the years in my work in restorative justice and doing dialogues in crimes of severe violence, one of the things that I remember at one point saying when I was asked to do a dialogue in a crime of severe violence, and it involved a child who happened to be and it was a 12-year-old girl who was the same age as my daughter. And I remember saying, I thought as a Christian, I should be able to engage in this conversation and be a facilitator for these people who really want to come together. And then I would just wake up like in a sweat and crying, and then recognize I can't at this stage in my life, having a 12-year-old daughter, engage in that process, because it needs to be a trusting relationship with a facilitator as well. And if I couldn't do that, then I needed to pull myself out of it, and I did. And so that's, I think, part of that learning of what we bring and who we are, and acknowledging that and knowing where our boundaries are as well. So I hope that is something that we spend time in trainings doing and having conversation about, because I think it's so important, which makes me think of, and I mentioned that as well, just the idea of power. We haven't talked about that. I felt like that was a really significant part of the training, and something that we need to continue to work on and work with. And so I'm just wondering what thoughts maybe you all have just in thinking about power as a component of the training and facilitation. And I'll just let whoever wants to start go.
Well, I'll just go ahead and go. I really appreciate what you just said, Lorraine, because I was thinking, you know, one of the things that we also didn't do 30 years ago, we just assumed everybody, that iMessages worked for everyone, right? We assumed that, that, there, that there was a way to talk when you were in conflict that was acceptable. So you know, heightened emotions, or even expressing, I'm really angry right now. You wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't do it. You'd say, when you this, I feel because, and you know, I think we have come a long way in recognizing that because otherwise we're causing harm by squelching people so just recognizing that if I'm uncomfortable, it's because I've got issues to work on, like you talked about, with as having the case with the 12-year-old. I That to me was really important. I also am reminded of, um, that as facilitators, we sometimes don't realize the power that we have or what we bring to the situation. And so again, it's that self-awareness. Like I can remember doing, you know, and this is also reflective, but I remember doing juvenile cases, you know, and so here's the juvenile who broke windows in a car, or and no, it was in a building, and the adults were all around. There was this juvenile, and then I being an adult, and I'm like, and so the kids usually will say whatever you want. So yeah, yes. Well, if they would say a word, because usually they just nodded their head. You know, that's but because and so not really acknowledging that power even in that room to be able to facilitate a process that possibly engages the young person more or deeper. All that young person wanted to do is, okay, I'm going to agree to whatever you want me to do, I'm going to do because it's all these adults around. So um, recognizing your own power is important depending upon the situation and the uh, you know, positional power. I recognize for me as the executive director here in Central States, I'd like to, you know, I'd like to feel as though I'm like one of the people. And the reality is in conflict, in a situation when there's conflict, you know, honestly, I'm not one of the people, even if I really want to be. And I need to own that because otherwise, um, I can cause harm. And I have to say it has happened because I'm just delusional at times. I'm just delusional. But anyway, that's what I would have to say.
I think one of the things that I noticed about power as it appears in the training is that it was shot through everything in ways that really, I think, partly because we had gathered a group of folks who have been working with these tools a lot, we all kind of felt how fragile the tools are, because there hasn't been enough kind of system-wide reflection on how power even shows up in the tools we try to use. Uh, so I think it's important to recognize that our the language of tools is also deceptive, in a way, right? It's not just about putting this thing in your hands and then you can use it on these abstract bits out here. It's not just tightening screws or bolts. It's work that is tough and adaptive because it involves humans in community and relationship with each other. And so all of it really, I mean, past the who are we kind of work, it starts with asking, what are we even trying to do here? What's our purpose? What's our purpose in this training? What's our purpose in this intervention? What's our purpose in this conversation? And then if we can discover that, if we could speak to that, what we want it to be, like my purpose in this conversation is to learn as much as I can, that impacts how we apply what we think are tools, how we manage ourselves in the situation, how we practice awareness of the power that we bring into the situation. All of those things are impacted by the question of what are we trying to do here?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so fascinating, the power dynamics, even as the facilitators, right? You try to say, I'm in this with you, but depending on how people interpret power dynamics, responsibility, that even goes back to our trauma-informed care, trauma-informed awareness. Power dynamics are so embedded in that, from our contextual upbringing, how power was decision-making processes were done in our formative years, how we then interpret that in practice as we move into different roles of leadership, authority, and of power. So I would say that is so complex, particularly even when you're facilitating. So two thoughts that come to my mind that were kind of highlights or parable moments for me around power. One was, Michelle, when you were sharing the story, and I might mess it up here, so feel free to jump in, but when you were talking about doing an evaluative work of a restorative justice process, I think in a school, and you talked about going in to evaluate the process. And I must say, this story, I'm going to get to the hook line here, but this story has stayed with me since the training, and I have been pondering it deeply. It was really about the teacher who was tasked with creating circle process for the students who were in a restorative context, right? The school had several discipline issues and so forth. Michelle, feel free, you can add on and check me on the story. I'm okay? Okay. And these students come in, as Michelle tells the story, after lunch, and there was some conflict with these young women, and they basically told the teacher in charge, we need space. They had gotten the tool. You couldn't see how the circle process, according to Michelle's story, was working at every angle of the school. But here was this moment after lunch where these young women, and even recapping it, I must say, I'm getting goosebumps, that they just run in, and I was a former teacher of middle school students, so it resonates with me. They run in after lunch and they say, Miss So-and-so, can we get a space? We need to do a circle process. And I love how Michelle says, I think they were using a lipstick as the talking piece, right? They were using what they had around community, around conflict. And so the tool becomes transformed for the context, and it works. But we all need space for practice. And so, yeah, and if you could just bear with me here, not to take too much time, but that reminds me so much of like a kingdom moment when Jesus says the kingdom belongs to the children, right? And sometimes we are overcomplicating our tools, right? The tools are vital, but I would say the space might be more important, right? Like we need to give the tools, we need to have the training. But when I left from the training, I would say a highlight for me was that I had space. I had space to be with other leaders. I had space to engage. There was a commitment at the beginning for us to have our common ground spaces. What do we agree on? What do we want, Jacob, to your point? What do we want this time to be? And I really felt, without being drawn back to that flip chart, what did we say again we wanted it to be? It was held in our center without it being in the center. And that just began to create so many wonderful pockets of exploring together. And the other piece, and I'll stop here, is the vulnerability to share where we've been practicing and it didn't go well, right? People were taking off their hats and saying, yeah, I remember going through something and it didn't go well. And this is what I'm learning. And this is what I'm reminded of. I think a highlight was we all seem to have, I don't want to speak for everyone, but there was a synergy around trauma-informed care, right? Like that may be a step that we have to re-immerse and emerge in as we try to do this work and we step into the space. It's sometimes you can say, oh, I'm the facilitator and I know the things, but that empathy and sensitivity to how trauma will impact the care and the work of restorative practice is so critical. And I think we became aware of that, so many of us, in different ways, for us personally again, and then the work that we want to see, the life-giving work, the healing work, the knitting together work, and even the knowing where we need to sometimes disconnect that we might heal. Yeah.
Thank you. It is taking me back to the training, just having this conversation again. And I just want to say I think the richest things for me was the fact that from this amazing group of people that came together, that we had our evaluations were, the responses to the questions were like 12 pages long. Like, never has that ever happened in any training that I've done. And at first it can be a little overwhelming, like, ooh, was it that painful? Like, but it wasn't. It was a mixture. It was like, because we asked, what about this? Could this be done differently? And people had so many suggestions, which again goes to the expertise of the group that we brought together to say, well, what about this? Because there's not one way. We can't give a cookie cutter and say, if you do this, then this will happen, or this is where it should, this is how you should do this. There are multiple ways, and that's why, we do have all of these tools, and that's why we want more, and that's why we want to open that up, because that's what it provides. That's what we can dig deep within ourselves to find different ways of doing that. And I thought that was so significant to have that many ideas come out of it, and that much feedback was, I think, a gift, honestly. So that has been amazing. I want to make sure we have time and just to hear some questions or take some questions, but also to talk about and what's next. And I think some of that will come in some of the questions that people have submitted. I want to start with one that came up that someone asked, Michelle, they wanted just to hear you say more about sometimes iMessages don't work for people. Like, what are some other strategies, and maybe push that out a little bit, what you mean by iMessages don't always work for people.
Well, I the reason why I say it is for some people, it's not a natural way of speaking. And so therefore it doesn't work. It feels and can sometimes come across as being contrived and patronizing, I will say. So I'm not saying that they're bad, but what I did at the training, I opened up a devotion with the Council of Jerusalem. Before Jesus, Jesus wasn't even gone long before there's this major conflict in and I don't think they called it the church. It was just still a movement. It wasn't even a church. It was in the movement. Whether circumcised or not circumcised, meat, and I mean all of the things, because you're having one culture and others joining, and two culture. It's a intercultural competency development moment, and so the scriptures doesn't say. I just don't imagine. They said they talked until everyone had an opportunity to speak. I just don't imagine that iMessages were the key to that resolution. I think what Hyacinth says, like there was a space created and provided for people to have this very painful, because this was not an easy conversation. This impacted identities. This even had theological implications. I mean, they had all the things, but everyone had the opportunity to speak, and then a solution came about. So Yeah, I think sometimes we can rely on certain tools to the point where they're vapid and that, and I think that's that tool could be that at times. That's what I will say.
I think one of the other things about that statement that I feel like I learned, 50 years ago in my social work classes, was maybe it's why I liked it for a while, because I also feel like it can be used as a blaming statement. Like, I feel uncomfortable when you did something, so I'm putting it back on you. So I'm not really saying what I'm still using it as a weapon against you. So instead of just saying, I feel uncomfortable because it's, I feel uncomfortable when you did something. So I think just being careful, just that language itself, I think understanding that it can be used that way as well. So yeah. I think one of the questions is that, just thinking about the churches, how someone asked, how can these trainings be incorporated into our congregations long-term for community engagement? And then how do we engage the church body to resolve different disagreements within the church? So what comments do you have to that question?
Okay, I know.
Humility. I feel like, and that's what's difficult. Humility is difficult for all of us, right? To one, acknowledge that, okay, we got a problem here in this church, or I have a serious problem with that person. And so there has to be a sense of, I think, of humility, but, and also, there has to be the willingness to, to engage. I mean, someone said today, it it's good to have okay, how it's I'm not gonna quote it properly, but it's one thing when the arsonist agrees to not start any more fires, but if the arsonist still wants to start fires, how are you going to have a conversation, or and so that idea that what's the purpose? What's my purpose in engaging in this? And also that other person or the congregation, what is the purpose? So that there's a clear purpose that everyone's willing to come together around. So humility would be one word that I would say.
I would just also name that a culture of communication. Like, instead of us always becoming responsive, right? Like, okay, oh, there was a conflict. Now we need to do the work of conflict. Kind of going back even to Jacob, when you said, so what's our purpose? So when we decide that we are a church, that we are a community together, what in our mission and vision statement guides us for how we want to be together? And so we start with our mission and we start with our vision, and then we commit to practices that are around that. And I would imagine that if we are deciding that we want to be a faith community or an institution, organization together, that is guided by mission and vision, then we want to start saying, so because of this purpose, how do we want to be together? And what do we need so that we can do that? Rather than, we recognize there's conflict, because as it was stated earlier, conflict exists. It is already there. It is underneath the surface. It lives among you, even if all things seem completely well. There is some point of tension that will arise. And so it's not being responsive. It is, to me, these are my thoughts, it is already having a culture of communication. And what is our communication design that becomes embedded in our identity? And then we keep growing in how to live into that, how we express that. And this is alive. This is a live work, because we are beings that are daily, hopefully dying to self, right? And being renewed, going through an ongoing transformational process. So how I engage with that story yesterday or 10 years ago, may have a completely different, hopefully a more renewed, transformed wellness perspective of how I want to embrace or engage. So that's what I would say.
And I'll see you, Hyacinth, and I'm going to raise you this. if we don't have this culture of communication in our churches, something else will provide the tools for communication. It will come from some other culture. And if it's coming from the one that's surrounding our churches right now, in our context in the United States, it's not going to look pretty. That's what we're seeing. It's so many churches and their people that don't look a thing like Jesus engaging in conflict, don't look a thing like the early church, knowing what it looks like for everybody to say their thing, be able to hold space for that. It's not going to look like that. And so what it looks like for our churches to take this up is it's an all the time commitment. It's like it's actually how we communicate with each other. And the best time to start practicing is right now.
Maybe that leads into the question of someone asking how to communicate across ideological communities of belonging divide. How do we do that? I think we touched on that. If we have that culture of communication, that's a healthy, trying to create that healthy culture, but anything you want to add to that?
I mean, I think this is one of the more challenging things for us to imagine. I think it still starts with knowing and managing the self. But then it becomes challenging when you think about engaging others. And sometimes it's because of specific others in our lives that we maybe have a history of engaging poorly around ideological difference. We have a history of those conversations not going the way that we wish. For me, my training is primarily as an ethicist, which means you are schooled in tools for taking apart an argument, right? To understand the pieces and how your data and the grounds of your argument connect with the claim that you're making. And we learn to spot those specious arguments that don't really have any ground beneath them, right? And we see that all around in our culture. I think part of what we struggle with when we find ourselves kind of polarized into ideological commitments ourselves, sometimes when we're over against someone else, is that we are not taking the time and the care required to actually say the truth to ourselves about why we believe what we believe, and then to ask the other, why do you believe what you believe? Where is this coming from for you? So that if we're imagining the iceberg model that Hyacinth was speaking of, right? Like underneath the water, our icebergs may meet somewhere. We'll never know if we don't have the details out on the table, right? We don't know because we haven't asked the right questions. We haven't explored ourselves. We haven't explored what's going on for the other. And so I think, it's easy to feel and right and absolutely justifiable in our context to feel anxiety about the ideological divide between us. And really, I think, this is me making a proposal, right? The only way through this is to actually do the work, to dig down into it in ourselves, dig down into it in conversation with others, to try to make this this thing that we're doing together human again, rather than operating at this kind of ideological level that unfortunately transcends, surpasses humanity sometimes.
Hyson, Rochelle, do you have anything you want to add to that?
First, I got to find my mouse. What came to mind when you were talking, Jacob, is also Paul and Barnabas. And they had to part ways, and there's some indications that later on they were able to resolve that issue. But whatever it was, it just wasn't going to happen at that moment. And so, and oftentimes that's kind of expressed as something bad, and I just think that is allowing for humanness to happen. Whatever, because sometimes we can force an engagement that it's just not ready for yet. And so that's also part of that self-regulating emotional intelligence and just sometimes just sitting in the discomfort until such time it can be addressed or and I also think of also that in some time and letting go of what a healthy conflict and resolution is. You know, because we sometimes we go into it and think, okay, I'll know if this is resolved if this and this happens. And sometimes the the healthy resolution for that moment is that the conversation happened. You know, I guess what I'm trying to speak to is just the ongoing nature of what it means to be in relationship, be in community, learning to communicate well, that it can continue. It can sometimes. That's one thing that I thought of.
So I hope to the person who wrote this question, I'm kind of answering it, but what I'm really drawn into in this in my initial response, before I can even make a decision, is really starts for me with love, right? And I don't want that to sound abstract or aloof, but that's what Jesus says. Like, okay, even the pagans, like, they love themselves. So I may not agree with you, and we might not be able to be on the same team in the same way we used to be, which I think, Michelle, you're getting at that. But what does love look like between us, right? What does community look like between us when we ground it in love? And so I don't have to agree with everything that someone, there's plenty of people who I love deeply, and there are certain things that we might work at together, and there's other things that we don't work at because it's just not the right fit or right match. But my posture of engagement remains, or my aspirational posture remains patient, kind, not self-seeking, not easily angered, not keeping of wrong. And I would also say a curiosity remains. It is not my, because of my value, it doesn't give me permission to judge. It gives me permission to live my value and to do that in a way that still honors who you are as a child of God. And so I
still want you to be able to have a meal. I still want you to be, I want you to eat. You know, that's what I still want you to eat.
Yes, I still want, and I think that's for me sometimes where I see the slippery tension is that when we have difference, how do we choose to hold or care for people and spaces when there is difference, right? Like, because I don't agree with you, you can hold that value and I can hold mine too. But then we decide how we will be together. That doesn't make you less of your belovedness because I do not agree.
Hyacinth, I just want to be you when I grow up. Like you live out the fruits of the spirit. That's all I can say. You do.
On the journey. Come on, Lorraine. We're on the journey.
We're on a journey. I think that also addresses someone sent in a question thinking about our current cultural propensity, you know, to cancel and dehumanize those that we don't agree with, that we're in conflict with, was asking, how do we engage conflict as Christians in a manner that rehumanizes, that allows us to look at the other and see a beloved child of God? And I think that's what we're talking about. How can we do that even when we know that we don't agree? And I think that does come from a place of centeredness for ourselves and getting to that place, Hyacinth, that you were talking about. How can I hold my values and engage in that kind of you know, conversation with someone who I know that we're not ever going to agree, but doesn't mean
I'm going to share this because I'm, needless to say, I'm in that particular situation. And what I've had to do is because it's not going to be resolved. But one thing that I know, and Hyacinth, like, how do I still love that person and wish? And so, my practice has been to pray for them and asking God to give them things that I want in my life. And I'm still, still doing it to a point, still doing it and I don't know when it will stop, but what I do know is that there is an impasse, and but I want the best for them, so I will pray that God blesses them with what I want in my life. I'm just throwing that out there.
Well, I want to just say thank you to each of you. It's been such a rich conversation. I so appreciate each of what you bring to the conversation and am honored to be doing this work with you. So thank you for joining me. This webinar is, I just want to acknowledge that it is part of our Learn, Pray, Join initiative for this 2 months through mid-November has been on conflict transformation. So the training was part of that, but we plan to continue. This is part of my ongoing work. And I think we've kind of been acknowledging that we're on the journey together with one another that will continue. So we're looking to host additional trainings over the next year or two, or however many. Someone asked specifically about Mid-Michigan. Feel free to contact me if there's a place that is interested in training. We want to continue to host trainings and be involved in trainings, and we would like to do that regionally. This first one was on the East Coast, but we know we want to plan one for Midwest. We're in conversation about one on the West Coast. So it is part of our commitment to this work to continue it. So I want to thank you all again for joining on this journey. In closing, I also want to encourage you to visit the Mennonite Church website, subscribe to Peacemail. We have that in the chat for you. You can support our peace and justice initiatives, and there will be a link to that as well. And as I mentioned, the Learn, Pray, Join initiative for this period is on conflict transformation. So please feel free to check out those resources that we have on that Learn, Pray, Join webpage. But for now, I will sign us off and thank you once again for joining me, and thanks for being part of this. And I look forward to seeing where we go from here.